When they arrived on the scene, they found the victim injured inside the residence with a gunshot wound to his head. Kelly Ann Jordan claimed her boyfriend was shot, and she said, "I don't know what happened."
The investigators found 4 .45 high-point caliber shell casings in the roadway outside of this incident location.
They did see where the house was struck by gunfire from the outside. You can start piecing the puzzle together, and a drive-by shooting would be the most likely scenario in that moment.
How do you sum up someone's whole life? Timothy was a protector. Like, he protected the people that he cared about. He never, for 6 years, let me walk to my car by myself, ever. And he would get up before me and go crank up my car so it'd be nice and warm. And then he would walk me to my door every morning just so nothing would happen to me.
I always called him Timothy, but his middle name is actually Rambo. Everyone called him that most of the time. Timothy was very outgoing, kind. He loved his family. His mom was his world.
He was the first person that would come and help you if your car broke down. He was the first person that would come help you fix it once he got you home. When I learned that Timothy had been shot, I really just couldn't believe it.
When an event or violent crime happens, people start talking, and it becomes a game of telephone. Everything that was coming to investigators at that time was hearsay. No one had actually seen this crime occur. And the best we got was somebody who was in the area at the time who said that they saw a motorcycle.
They saw a black motorcycle drive down the road at a high rate of speed, firing shots into Mr. Ramsey's house. But we couldn't give us a suspect description because the motorcyclist was wearing a helmet. The investigators were able to locate some video footage about a mile from the incident location, and it was a motorcycle that matched the neighbor's description, leaving the scene around the same time as we would expect him to get to that intersection, but you can't see details.
There was very little evidence at that point in time. It was baffling to law enforcement. Who shot him, why he was shot, that was unclear.
It's excruciating. We have no closure. To just feel like someone that you care about and love's life is just taken away and nothing done about it. I was not going to rest until someone was charged.
On September 10th, 2012, someone shot and killed Timothy Ramsey during a drive-by in Anderson County.
Family and friends have spent 7 years wondering who pulled the trigger. Investigators reopened the case.
They took this case, there was not a lot to go on. Shooting into a dwelling, there's going to be some consequences.
When I first reviewed the case file, my initial reaction was a little bit of shock at how little was in it. That's why when we realized we probably should go back and re-interview every single one of the witnesses that were interviewed to begin with.
We started to hear street talk from various folks in the county. Names were coming up. 2 of those names were Cody Murphy and Randy Kennedy.
Both of them were known meth users in the Piedmont area. And when I first got this case, Cody Murphy was in prison for distribution of methamphetamine, and Randy Kennedy moved to Greenville County, which is the next county over from Anderson.
Investigators started to understand that around the time that the shooting took place, Cody Murphy and Randy Kennedy were engaged in a back and forth. There had been physical violence between them, potentially some guns discharged, and there had been threats made primarily by Randy Kennedy against Cody Murphy.
A lot of the witnesses we interviewed said Cody Murphy had been beat up by Randy Kennedy a lot.
But it was unclear what Timothy Ramsey had to do with the conflict that Randy Kennedy and Cody Murphy were having at the time. Detectives found out the day of the shooting. Cody Murphy had gone to pick up a mutual friend of Randy Kennedy's and his by the name of Ashley Thompson. He picked her up and took her back to hang out with their group of friends.
Close the door just for privacy reasons.
Yeah, people come up and down all the time.
Yeah.
All right. So, obviously, we talked on the phone a little bit. You know that we're looking into the cold case from 2012.
Yeah, but I've known Timothy since we were young, so
Right.
I don't think that I just don't know why anybody would have a reason to want to do that, period.
Can you just kind of just start from the beginning and just let us know everything that you know about the day of the incident?
So I was at Chuck and Jerry's off Hollinsville Road that morning, and Cody Murphy was supposed to come pick me up. Well, when he got there, he was so messed up, and he couldn't hold his motorcycle up.
So his only means of transportation back then
Was his
car,
motorcycle?
car,
Yeah, it was a motorcycle. It was a motorcycle.
Okay.
100%, yeah. So I called little Randy, which is Randy Kennedy, to come and pick me up and give me a ride.
Does he have a motorcycle? Or
No.
did he have a motorcycle?
No, he was in a black. It was a black Infinity, and Cody was still sitting there on his bike at Chuck and Jerry's. That's when the altercation happened.
Okay.
Randy, I guess, had beef about something, so Randy jumped on him.
When you talk about the fight, was it like a beat down fight? Like,
If he didn't have his helmet, he probably would have got his face busted up pretty bad.
and Cody didn't put up much of a fight, or did he try
No.
to fight back?
Oh no. Mm-mm.
Was he like more mad about getting beat up, or you leaving with Randy, or do you?
I think he was more mad from what it sounded like me leaving with Randy after Randy jumped on him like that.
Okay. So it's kind of like embarrassing. I
Yeah.
guess, to him?
Kind of probably.
Do you ever remember Cody to carry a gun?
Sometimes, yeah, no one too.
Anything else that you've heard over the years that we need to look into? People we need to go talk to that we may not know about?
I wish I could remember everything down to a T for y'all. Honestly, I can't remember.
So she really gave some insight into the feud between Randy Kennedy and Cody Murphy. Randy attacked Cody that morning, beat him up, and then Ashley decided to leave with Randy Kennedy. Just got beat up in front of some people that know you. You know, that's gonna make you pretty angry. But we didn't know what Randy Kennedy's and Cody Murphy's relationship or connection was to Rambo Ramsey. We didn't know why either one of them would want to hurt Rambo Ramsey. Speaking of Randy Kennedy in reference to 2012 homicide of Timothy Ramsey.
I'm Detective Daniel Martin.
Scotty Hill.
There are a couple things that have come up in our investigation.
Specifically between you and Cody Murphy going on.
Oh, yeah. Just start with what your relationship with Cody Murphy was back in that time. in 2012.
Me and Cody, back then we had a falling out. We fell out about a girl.
And then you saw him at Chuck and Jerry's was the first time you actually got a hold of him.
Yeah.
Did a number on him. It was just you kind of smacking him around?
Yeah, like he had his motorcycle helmet on. Ashley gets in the car with me. I was riding around, but the whole time, Cody's blowing Ashley's phone up. Man, I'm calling back to back to back to back to back. So I'm like, man, just tell him I dropped you off at, tell him I'm taking you to Timothy's and I dropped you off. That's where you at Timothy's. And so she tells him, look, I'm going to Timothy's. That's where I'm about to be at.
So that really jumped out at us. And that's the first time we had heard that Cody thought Randy was at Timothy's house, Rambo's house, because Ashley Thomason told him.
But I never took her here, though. That's the thing. I brought her to the dollar store. He was the only one that thought I was here, and she was here.
He kind of led us down that path that the morning of the shooting, Cody believed that Randy was at Rambo's house.
And that was really key to this investigation because it put together why someone would shoot up that house. It gave us the reason behind the shooting.
When Timothy and I met, both of my parents were abusing drugs. Like, he saved me from that. Like, both of us together, we're gonna be sober. We're not gonna be like our parents. You know, we're gonna do better.
He actually was waiting on me to come and give him a ride to go job hunting, and we were supposed to hang out that day, and I was a little late picking him up, and by the time I got there, everything had happened.
Elaine called and says, look, Timothy just got killed. I thought, what are you talking about? What's going on? I said, Ashley, call Cody. Like I say, he'd blown the phone up the whole time. And as soon as that happens, we call him. He never answers the phone, never again. Like, from that time to 3-4 days, he never answered the phone.
Did you ever talk to Cody about what happened afterwards?
No, never.
No,
I looked for him. And then, like, the time change, like, he'd be in jail.
So you had no kind of beef or anything with Timothy at all?
I hang out with Timothy every day. He ain't had no problems with nobody. He's pretty cool with every damn body. I mean, he just wasn't no fighting type.
His phone placed him in a different location. Witnesses placed him in a different location. So we pretty much felt like Randy Kennedy was alibied at the time of the shooting. Now we have to prove that Cody Murphy did it. We can prove Randy did not do it. How do we prove Cody Murphy did it? Kayla Nally was Cody Murphy's baby mama. When we spoke with Kayla, my impression was she had moved on from Cody.
I mean, me and Cody aren't that level. Like, we had split up that June. He didn't even see his kids. Cody don't care about his kids.
And you've since moved on, and you're not.
Oh yeah, me and my guy, we've been together 6 years since October. We got together that October.
Okay. I figured when we talked to her again, if we needed her to help us put Cody in prison, she would be willing to do that because she didn't care about him anymore. She admitted that Cody Murphy was the only person who knew where she hid her gun, and that Cody Murphy was at her house the morning of the shooting, and that after he left, she noticed her gun was missing. She said she had a high point .45, which is the first time someone was able to name the gun that was used.
That is a specific detail that had not been released. So that told us that the detectives were on the right track.
It's a step in the right direction. That's enough to make a charge. But we did need a confession for a conviction. For beyond a reasonable doubt, you need 99.9%. We were nowhere near 99.9% at this point in time.
One big missing piece was this confession. And getting that confession was going to complete that puzzle and solidify a conviction. That was intentional. Cody knew the date of the shooting. We want to play to his emotions. It was strategic. If we don't get this confession, then there's a possibility that we don't get closure for the Ramsey family.
I arranged for him to be brought up on September 10th. On September 9th, I get a phone call at 1 o'clock in the afternoon telling me that Cody Murphy's in the Anderson County Detention Center a day early. And I was kind of just stunned for a minute. It definitely blew my advantage. You weren't supposed to be brought up here till tomorrow. They wouldn't got you a day early. What kind of, you like fast food? Is there any restaurant in particular you like?
Well, I ain't had the restaurant in 7 years.
I know.
If I got a choice, I'm mushroom Swiss from Hardee's.
Mushroom Swiss from Hardee's.
Or McDonald's.
No, that's fine. I can make that. Let me make sure they still make that burger.
And a tea.
And a tea. Sweet tea?
Yes. I haven't had sweet tea in 7 years.
My initial plan was always to be, his buddy. We're just two bros hanging out. So I really fed into that a good bit with him. I have 4 years worth of your jail phone calls.
With Kayla?
Kayla, well, at first you were talking to a bunch of girls.
Damn it, don't
tell her about that. No.
We wasn't together the first 2 years we was talking. Don't tell her that. Oh my God.
Yeah. I was like, dang, man, how many girls are going to be there to pick him up when he gets out of prison?
Just one.
I'm glad that's all worked out, because I thought, man, he's going to have like 4 girls there fighting the day he gets out. Because who was it? I can't remember all their names.
Erica, Rachel.
Yeah. What's that one girl's name? And that's how I kind of built the trust with them, was I'm not this cop that you always deal with. Like, I'm not that regular guy. I'm not here to hammer you about a case. We're just here to talk. Tomorrow's it. I didn't hear any about any of that. She went and talked to me.
Detective Hill says, I'm just going to tell you the meat and potatoes of our case. I don't care. I don't have anything to hide. I already know you did it, and I'm going to tell you how I know you did it.
I'm trying to be open and honest with you. Some of the people who did talk to me one of the big ones was Ashley Thomason. And Ashley was with you in the morning this all happened. When Randy jumped you, knocked over your motorcycle. And then she was the one who texted you and said, hey, we're going to Rambo's house. So that's kind of where we begin with what we have on you, just so you know. I know you went to Twyla's over there, go into her room, took her gun. It was a black Hi-Point 45, and the bullet that killed Rambo was shot from a Hi-Point 45. And we had a witness who saw a black motorcycle and described a white male.
Who's the witness?
He's not anybody that you know. He just lives in the area.
So how many shots did he say was fired since he's seen it?
4. And he actually is a good witness for you, believe it or not, because he said he didn't slow down, which kind of takes away a lot of the intent. If you're trying to kill somebody, you're going to stop, aim, fire. You're not going to ride on a motorcycle, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's pretty hard to prove intent for me. And then we had a similar motorcycle to yours, because on video down the street. drive by that right after the shooting, which all matched up with what we knew you were driving that day from Ashley Thomason. Then we had 4 people come forward and tell us that you told them about it. That's it in a nutshell. I'm not looking at anybody else.
I don't know where to begin. Like, what's the hard evidence that statements?
The statements are pretty good because they all told real consistent story. I'm telling you, none of them got a single thing out.
Just so we're in agreements and it's on recorded, I'm not admitting nothing. I'm not saying I did anything.
That's fair. The whole goal at the beginning of the interview was to connect with them, have them feel comfortable, have them open up. But he didn't confess as quickly as I thought he would when I laid it out there. That's why I kind of shifted towards Randy. When you look at this case, I mean, it's all about Randy Kennedy. And I'm going to basically torturing you to the point where you snapped. That's what I believe happened. And I heard rumors about it. Some of the stuff he did to you, apparently like shooting at you before. I want to make this clear right now. I know what Randy Kennedy was doing to you. I've spoke to Randy Kennedy myself. I heard y'all got into a fist fight. And you were like, all right, it's done. It's over.
It wasn't for him.
Honestly, when I was going through this case, I sympathized with you more than anyone else. That was messed up what he was doing to you. 100%. That's
You don't have a clue.
No, I met him. I do have a clue because I.
What did he say?
He wasn't talking. I believe that Rambo Ramsey was an accident. 100% an accident. And I know that because you can take the best sniper in the world and he couldn't make the shot that killed Rambo at all. It went through 2 walls and hit him right in the head. It was a freak accident while you were riding by on a motorcycle. I felt like if I made Randy our common enemy, then it's not just Cody's enemy, he's my enemy too. We both hate Randy Kennedy. He's a bad guy. He's a dangerous guy. That was another way to kind of get to where he was looking at me more as a friend instead of the cop who's trying to put a manslaughter charge on him. If I could charge him with it, I probably I would. Because Randy Kennedy needs to be off the streets more than Cody Murphy. Give me 1 minute, I'll be right back. I really thought, okay, that's going to be enough. He's going to confess right here.
Hey, Detective Hill. I hear you back.
Alright. Sorry, they made me pat you down anytime.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm in strip search 3 times a day.
My thoughts on it was, this is actually good for me because she's going to be on my side this whole time. Based on my one conversation with her, she doesn't like Cody. She's over him. She doesn't care what happens to him. She's going to want him to confess to get this over with. All right, man. She's on the way. It's been approved. Y'all can sit in this room, talk. I won't be in here. I will tell you this room is recorded and monitored, so I'm not going to BS you like that.
I already know what it is.
Okay.
Trust me, I've been here before.
Fair enough. It allowed me to show him that, yeah, I got your back. Like, I'm going to help you out with this. Hello? She's here? Yep. All right. I'm going to let y'all have a minute, so I'm going to go get her. I was feeling pretty good at this point. We're still in good shape, and she's going to come in and she's going to be like, you better tell him everything. I'm sick of having to deal with this, you know. You better tell the truth. I was thinking we're going to have this wrapped up in 5 minutes. She ran into the room and jumped in his arms, and I thought, oh man, I completely misread this situation.
Hey, baby.
I haven't given you a kiss in 10 years.
And that threw me off, and I was like, oh, that she's not over him. She's not on our side. We were on the wrong day, and now we got the wrong person in the room with us.
He's charged me with voluntary manslaughter, which means he was purposely killed.
Okay.
I haven't said anything.
I haven't either. And I don't know.
No, I'm saying I haven't said nothing today.
I feel like you're getting bullied into doing something. His job is to get you to do this regardless of what it takes.
You're right. I'm not working.
He don't give a He's not gonna sleep less at night feeling any more about you or less about you or anything like that. He don't care.
I'm watching this going, okay, how do I get in there and how do I break this up? Because it did not go at all like I wanted it to. Hey, sorry to interrupt, but
No, you're good.
I want to make sure I was clarify that for you real quick. You can see I took the chair and faced it more towards her than Cody. I've spent hours talking with Cody, building a rapport, and now I'm like, I just start over and do it all over again with her. The only chance to get this confession was to convince Kayla that I wasn't this horrible guy. I'm trying to be as open and honest with you as I can, because I do want to build some trust here. Our solicitor's office is very conservative when it comes to charging people, meaning they get antsy. If she didn't think she could win the case, we wouldn't have charged because it's so old. So I feel strongly about the case. She feels strongly about the case. We can prove the shots came from outside the house. We can prove it was a high point .45 caliber because they did a good job collecting that stuff. There are some people who didn't talk about the shooting, but talked about stuff that led up to it. Voluntary means you pulled the trigger on purpose. That's why he had to be charged with voluntary. Because it's not legal for me to charge him with involuntary. However, the court can change that. Here's my case. That's where we're at. I believe Randy Kennedy pushed you too far. If Randy did not attack you, if Randy did not run over your motorcycle, then you're right. This will not be okay. You will go to prison. Randy Kennedy is the villain in this story. 100% the villain. You just made a mistake. Because if I got that wrong, you're a cold-blooded killer who went and shot up the house for no reason.
But you believe in it and the solicitor believes in it. It's two different things.
I understand. I do. You're right. I don't have the authority to authorize deals. I can't even ask you to give me a statement in exchange for a deal. So that's why there's no offer on the table, because I don't have the authority to do that. But I get to speak at your sentencing.
What Detective Hill's approach was to ingratiate himself to Cody Murphy and to make him believe that he was going to go to bat for him, even though that was highly unusual, that it would make it look like Detective Hill was on Cody Murphy's side.
I really think he's trying to help us.
I
know you don't trust no cop, I know.
But if we go to trial on this right here, we're going to lose. Just off the evidence he had.
And if they find me guilty for this, you can get up to 30.
Which means I don't come home with you and the kids.
What he's trying to do is get it so I can plead down to involuntary. He can go to the solicitor and say, look, he needs to be pled down.
Right.
Or he needs to be charged with this and don't go no farther.
This guy can't guarantee any of that.
The solicitor's got to finally say something, honey. Yes, you're right. But his opinion counts, there, Tom. If he goes in there and tells that look, he's a cold-blooded killer, charge him with manslaughter, voluntary, and give him 30. In all honesty, like, if they give me a plea deal, like, he really saved my ass.
And I'm not trying to trick you into talking.
He's not making us do anything.
When Cody started defending me, that gave me the confidence to push him towards a confession. I kind of switched gears from trying to win Kayla over to now back on Cody, and now we're going to push him towards a confession. A lot of times these interviews are to gauge whether or not someone is cold-blooded or remorseful or whatever. I've sat across from a lot of killers. Unless you were just a great actor, you're not a killer, Cody. You might have done something that went wrong and somebody died, but you're not a killer. And I'm saying that while we're being recorded so that you know I mean it. This can't be taken away. If I try to change what I said in here, y'all can just play this video in court and I can look like an idiot. I just need to know this one thing. Did you do this and are you sorry for it? People who voluntarily kill someone aren't sorry for it. People who do it by mistake are sorry for it. So that's where we're at. I don't think you intended to kill Timothy Rambo Ramsey. I think you're pushed too far by Randy Kennedy. I don't know if you're sorry for it. Those first two things are 100% confirmed with me. I know you're not a killer, Cody. I just need to know if you're sorry. That's all I need from you, so I can go to bat for you.
What guarantee do I got they're gonna plead me now?
You can guarantee you're not going to trial. If you tell me you did it and you're sorry for it, then what's the point of a trial, right? That's what I have to know before I can even think about running that by anybody. Because that's important.
Well, if I do this, and if she don't want to plead me out, she wants to take me to trial, I'm clapped. Because I confessed.
She would go through me. She would go through me. So, if you did it and you're sorry for it, that goes way farther than anything you can possibly imagine. You're doing the time you deserve for this accidental killing right now. That's the way I look at it. You don't have to trust me.
I don't want to do something that backfire. Because I don't know what to do. And what he's got right now put me away for 30 years.
I knew I had him where I needed him. This is the final push to try to get this confession. Basically, what I'm going to tell the solicitor, I talked to Cody. I looked into his eyes. I don't think he's an evil guy. I don't think he's a bad dude. But I didn't get a statement from him. That's what I'm going to tell her. And that's me being fair and honest. I can't say 100% if he is remorseful about it. That's what I think is fair for what we've established today. I know it's a lot.
Do you want to do lawyer or do you want to talk? What is up to you?
If we take it to trial, then it's me not coming home.
You know what you need to do and you need to do it.
I think he wants to tell me, but not in front of Kayla. I had got the feeling that she truly did not know that he had committed this crime. My perception of it was that he had hid it from her because Kayla is the most important person in the world to Cody. If she thought anything negative about him, that was gonna crush him. The thought was, now, how do I separate them? When Cody asked for that cigarette, I knew, okay, that's my chance to get them apart, and it's my chance to do it without me being the bad guy.
James wants Sarah.
Yes, sir. Let's do it. I'm gonna put you in this room with our other detective, Ham, who's here.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that way you just sit in there and we'll be back in a more comfortable. It's a little bit cooler. We got outside. We had a little picnic table at the end of the building, which is where we let people smoke. So we get out there. He sits on top of the table. I light his cigarette and I sit down next to him. You only get one shot at this, and if we get back up there and you miss, well, that's a year's worth of work and hours of building a rapport with this guy, and it's over. 2 or 3 cigarettes is what my plan was, and slowly get back into, you need to tell me this. But as soon as I sat down, I saw him break down and start to cry. So I just put my arm around him, and the first words out of his mouth were, it was an accident. I didn't mean to kill him. You know, no one was supposed to die when I did this. I was trying to get Randy Kennedy to leave me alone, show him that I would shoot back if he didn't leave me alone, you know. And that I was excited, but I was like, oh crap, I didn't bring my recorder. I still had to get him to say it on the recording. I got him back upstairs as quickly as I could. Even when we got back in the room, I was still a little nervous because I didn't know if he was going to say it in front of Kayla. So I'm thinking, did I miss my opportunity by not recording this?
They didn't do this. Don't answer me. I haven't. Okay.
Look at me. Look away. It was an accident. He didn't know everything I do was come home. Right? Right?
Okay.
I done told him. They're gonna give me a plea deal. I'm not a killer. I'm just a drug dealer. I wasn't a killer.
So, what I'd like to write on here, Cody, with your permission, is on September 10th, 2012, I shot into a house, accidentally striking Timothy Ramsey, causing his death. One of the bullets struck Timothy Ramsey, killing him. This was an accident. I did not mean to kill Timothy.
Why did you shoot?
Randy's jumped on me. Randy shot at me. I won't even leave me alone. I won't even leave you alone. I figured if I shot, it'd stop. And he did.
Did you know Timothy?
I met him once. I didn't know him. We went on a hate basis.
I have to ask before I write it, did you use the High Point 45 wireless? I just have to add that in here at the bottom.
I'm sorry. I wasn't nobody supposed to die. I'm not a killer.
What has kept you from saying this for so long? How do you feel? Or what do you think? Or
I'm scared.
what do you wish you could change? Or
I wish I could take it all back, Caleb. Because no, I don't know the pain of losing a child. I hope I never have to go through it. A mother is not supposed to bury her kids, not a father is not a mother. The child is supposed to bury the parent. It ain't supposed to be the other way around. And I did that by accident. I did that because I was so far.
Cody Murphy wanted people to like him, and I was able to give him a way to get this off his chest and for him to still feel like I liked him at the end of it, and for Kayla to still have a positive relationship with him. I think for her, it was more she didn't want to believe that somebody she loved killed somebody. That was difficult for her.
Just sign it right there, and it'll be done. I gotta walk out, Cody. I gotta leave you in here, so if you want to say goodbye. Rules.
There's nothing more serious than taking someone's life and then getting someone to admit to you, especially someone who for hours did everything he could to try not to say it out loud. It's a pretty good rush.
Justice means looking at everything and coming up with the most equitable result, taking everything into consideration. And I do feel like what we came up with in the end did that.
It's so easy to look at a cold case and say, well, if they couldn't do anything with it back then, what am I going to do now? But if you're patient enough and you're willing to work hard enough, you can get some closure for a family that hasn't had it for years.
It's not so much what I miss about him. It hurts not seeing his life go forward. Never seeing him get married, have kids. There was a time in my life when he was everything to me. What hurts now about it is just knowing that he's missed out on so much.
Timothy was a very forgiving person. So I know that in this situation, Timothy would have voiced his opinion and said his piece, but he also would have forgave. And even though I'm not to that point yet, I hope that I can for my own benefit. Cody took somebody that meant something to a lot of people. He took a part of our family that took a part of our hearts, and we can't get that back.
It was supposed to be a day of small joys, the kind that rarely make history, because nothing dramatic ever happens inside them. February 14, 2018, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, began with the soft weight of routine. Students arriving with backpacks half-zipped, Valentine's cards tucked into folders, teachers adjusting lesson plans knowing the day would end earlier than usual. The air outside carried that familiar Florida warmth, humid and still, with sunlight spilling across sidewalks, and the parking lot like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Inside the building, laughter moved through hallways in fragments. A group of students paused near lockers, exchanging candy hearts and teasing each other about handwritten notes. Someone held a small bouquet wrapped in plastic, already slightly wilted under the heat. A teacher reminded a class that they would be dismissed early, and the announcement was met with the kind of relieved excitement only students understand. It was not a special day in the sense of importance, but in the sense of permission to feel light, distracted, briefly free. No one noticed the man walking toward campus, who would later become the center of one of the darkest chapters in American school history. He did not announce himself. There was no dramatic entrance, no visible sign that the ordinary rhythm of the day was about to fracture. He moved like someone trying not to be remembered, blending into the geometry of sidewalks, fences, and morning traffic. That man was Nicholas Cruz, a former student of the same school, now returning with something that no longer belonged to the world of classrooms and adolescence. What makes the beginning of this story so unsettling is not only what happened later, but how normal everything felt before it changed. The school was not in crisis. There was no visible alarm. There were no warnings in the air that people could collectively recognize. Instead, there was only the fragile illusion that spaces built for learning are naturally protected from the worst kinds of human behavior. That illusion would hold, right up until it didn't. Inside classrooms, teachers continued teaching, even as attention drifted toward the clock. Some students were already mentally packing their bags. Others were scrolling through phones under desks, waiting for the final bell. The building itself carried the quiet noise of institutions at midday, ventilation systems humming, chairs scraping lightly, distant footsteps echoing in hallways. It was the sound of nothing happening in particular, which is often what safety sounds like before it disappears. At some point in the mid-afternoon, a shift began, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from routine interruptions. There were sounds that didn't immediately register as danger. A sudden alarm, a change in movement in the corridors, confusion spreading in small clusters. In moments like this, human perception struggles to assign meaning quickly enough. People look for familiar explanations first: fire drill, technical malfunction, administrative procedure. The mind resists the idea that something catastrophic might already be unfolding. That hesitation, that brief delay between perception and understanding, would become one of the defining elements of what followed. As Cruz entered the school environment, he carried with him a set of intentions that would only later be reconstructed through investigation. At the time, those intentions were invisible to the people sharing the same space. He was not yet a headline. Not yet a case file. Not yet a symbol. He was simply another figure moving through a place that had no reason to expect him as a threat. Inside the building, students began to notice disruption in fragments. A door that should not have opened. A sound that didn't belong. A sudden wave of movement in a hallway that felt too fast, too disordered. Information traveled inconsistently, shaped by rumor, panic, and incomplete visibility. In environments like schools, where corridors intersect and classrooms isolate sound, reality often arrives in pieces rather than a single clear image. Teachers reacted instinctively, pulling students into classrooms, locking doors, pushing desks against entrances. These actions were not guided by certainty, but by training, intuition, and fear compressed into decision-making. Some classrooms fell into silence, so deep it felt almost unreal, as if sound itself had been switched off. Students crouched under desks, holding phones with trembling hands, sending messages that would later become some of the last communications from that day. Outside the building, the world did not yet fully understand what was happening inside. Parents began to arrive, drawn by alerts, rumors, and instinct. The parking lot slowly transformed into a gathering of uncertainty. People stood beside their cars with phones pressed to their ears, scanning faces, searching for information that refused to arrive in complete form. Time stretched differently there, minutes felt like hours, and every unanswered question became heavier with each passing moment. The internal experience of the school was something entirely different. Within those walls, perception narrowed. Sound became unpredictable. Movement became dangerous. Every hallway turned into a question of safety without guaranteed answers. Students and teachers navigated spaces they had walked 1,000 times before, but now those same spaces felt unfamiliar, reshaped by fear. What makes this moment so difficult to describe is not just the presence of violence, but the collapse of normal interpretive frameworks. Schools are built around predictability. Bells ring. Classes end. People move according to schedules. When that structure breaks, even temporarily, it creates a disorientation that amplifies every other sensation. In those early moments, no one could yet see the full scope of what was unfolding. Information was still forming. Stories were still incomplete. Reality had not yet settled into its final shape. And within that uncertainty, every decision made by those inside carried the weight of not knowing what came next. The tragedy of that afternoon was not only in what would eventually be counted and recorded, but in how quickly the ordinary transformed into something irreversible. A space designed for learning became a space defined by survival. A day marked by affection and routine became a moment that would be remembered not for its beginning, but for the rupture that followed it. And as the first minutes stretched forward into chaos, the school crossed a threshold it could never return from, even long after silence finally returned to its hallways, before the day that would later define it in public memory. Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School existed like many large American high schools in suburban Florida, structured, familiar, and built around the rhythm of bells, schedules, and seasonal transitions. Located in Parkland, the school served a community that often described itself as quiet, family-oriented, and removed from the kinds of urban crises that typically dominate national headlines. It was the kind of place where people believed that safety was not something constantly negotiated, but something already established. The campus itself reflected that assumption. Buildings were arranged in connected corridors, open walkways, and classroom clusters designed to encourage movement between spaces without friction. Palm trees lined the edges of parking lots, and the morning light would often spill across concrete paths in long, warm stretches. On normal days, the environment felt almost weightless, filled with the soft noise of teenage life unfolding in predictable patterns. Inside, the school functioned like a carefully managed ecosystem. Teachers moved between classrooms with lesson plans, attendance sheets, and graded assignments. Students shifted between social groups, academic pressures, and the quiet negotiations of adolescence. There were routines within routines, where students sat, which hallways they used, how they transitioned between classes. Even rebellion, when it appeared, was usually contained within familiar boundaries. Security at the school, like many others in the United States, relied on a combination of procedures, awareness, and layered access points rather than overt fortification. Doors were locked during instruction. Visitors were required to check in at the front office. Staff were trained to respond to emergencies according to established protocols. These measures were designed around probability, not certainty. They assumed that extreme violence was possible, but unlikely enough that daily life did not need to be defined by it. That assumption shaped how people experienced the space. Students did not think of their classrooms as vulnerable environments. Teachers did not prepare each lesson as if it might be interrupted by catastrophe. Parents did not drop their children off each morning with the expectation of danger. Instead, the school existed within a shared cultural agreement that learning spaces are fundamentally safe. Within that environment, students built their own micro-worlds. Friend groups formed across classrooms and extracurricular activities. Hallways became social corridors where conversations overlapped with movement. Even silence had structure, as students moved through it with headphones, books, or focused attention on their phones. Emotional intensity existed, but it was the intensity of adolescence, not survival. On the morning of February 14, 2018, that structure was intact. It was Valentine's Day, a date that already altered the emotional tone of the campus. Small gestures of affection appeared everywhere, folded notes passed between desks, candy distributed in plastic bags, flowers carried carefully through hallways. Even students, who did not actively participate in the tradition, could not avoid its presence. The atmosphere carried a sense of softness, as if the entire school had temporarily agreed to be less serious. Teachers noticed it too. Lessons were adjusted. Attention spans were expected to shorten. The day was understood as transitional, a partial school day ending earlier than usual. That expectation shaped behavior at every level. People mentally prepared to leave before they had even fully arrived. Outside the structured academic environment, however, there were individuals whose relationship to the school was already broken. Among them was Nicholas Cruz, a former student whose presence in the broader narrative would later be analyzed in detail through psychological evaluations, disciplinary records, and retrospective interviews. Long before any public understanding of his actions existed, he had already been part of the school's institutional memory in a different way. His time as a student had been marked by behavioral concerns, disciplinary interventions, and increasing separation from the social fabric of the school. These records, when later reviewed, formed a fragmented portrait of escalating instability. Teachers and staff had noted incidents of aggression, withdrawal, and difficulty maintaining consistent relationships with peers. Counselors had engaged with him at various points, attempting interventions that reflected the limitations of school-based behavioral support systems. Eventually, he was no longer part of the student population. But removal from the school did not mean removal from its orbit. Like many former students, he remained connected to the physical and emotional geography of the place, even if only in residual form. The school itself, however, continued forward, as institutions do, absorbing past individuals into archival memory rather than daily awareness. This separation between institutional continuity and individual instability is one of the central tensions that would later be examined in the aftermath of what occurred. Schools operate on the assumption that disruption can be identified, managed, and contained within their systems. But individuals who fall outside those systems do not always remain outside their influence or proximity. In the broader Parkland community, awareness of school safety issues existed, but it was often abstract. Discussions about security were typically tied to national news events rather than local experience. Drills were conducted periodically, but they were treated as procedural requirements rather than reflections of immediate threat. Students learned where to go in emergencies, but rarely imagined having to use those instructions in real conditions. That psychological distance is important. It shapes how warnings are interpreted, how behaviors are understood, and how anomalies are categorized. In environments where extreme events are rare, the mind naturally prioritizes normal explanations over abnormal ones. This cognitive bias is not negligence. It is how stability is maintained in everyday life. As the school day progressed toward its early dismissal schedule, this sense of stability remained intact. Movement through hallways increased as classes shifted toward final activities. Some students had already begun collecting belongings. Others waited for the final bell with growing impatience. The building was in a transitional state, neither fully in session nor fully dismissed, a liminal space where attention is often lowest and anticipation highest. It is within this kind of transitional environment that disruptions can have disproportionate psychological impact. Because expectations are already loosening, the boundary between normal and abnormal becomes less clearly defined. Sounds are more easily misinterpreted. Movement is more difficult to contextualize. People rely more heavily on the behavior of others to understand what is happening. At the same time, the physical structure of the school influenced how information traveled. Long hallways, intersecting corridors, and enclosed classrooms created conditions where visibility was limited and sound carried unevenly. A single event in one part of the building could be experienced very differently depending on location. Some would hear it clearly. Others would only sense that something had changed without knowing what. This fragmentation of perception would later become a key element in reconstructing the events of that day. But at this stage, it existed only as ordinary uncertainty. A school preparing to end the day early does not yet interpret small disruptions as part of a larger pattern. And so, as February 14th moved closer to its midpoint, the campus remained in a delicate balance between routine and transition. Students continued their conversations, teachers continued their instruction, and the building continued to hold the quiet assumption that the rest of the day would unfold exactly as expected. It was within that assumption that everything remained, for a brief moment longer, still intact. On most school days at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, the focus naturally falls on schedules, grades, and the quiet social gravity of adolescence. But on February 14, 2018, the emotional atmosphere was different in a way that students and teachers could feel, but not necessarily name. It was Valentine's Day, and that alone shifted the rhythm of the campus. Small acts of affection carried through hallways like soft interruptions to routine life, shaping the day into something slightly more emotional, slightly less structured. This is important when understanding what was lost, because what was disrupted was not just a building or a timetable, but a living community of individuals who each occupied their own small universe inside the school. To understand the impact of the event, it is necessary to see the people inside it not as a group defined by tragedy, but as separate lives intersecting in a shared space. Students arrived that morning with the usual mix of anticipation and fatigue that defines teenage life. Some were thinking about upcoming exams. Others were focused on social plans after school. A few were already emotionally absorbed in the symbolic weight of Valentine's Day, exchanging notes, chocolates, and carefully chosen words that might feel small in any other context, but carried significant meaning at that age. These gestures were not trivial. They were expressions of identity, belonging, and connection. Teachers, too, moved through the day with an awareness of its unusual schedule. Early dismissal meant compressed lessons, adjusted pacing, and a general expectation that attention would be divided. Many instructors tried to maintain focus, while also acknowledging the lightness of the day. In classrooms, instruction often blended with conversation. Academic structure coexisted with emotional looseness. It was a day where seriousness and informality overlapped. Within this environment, each student at the school carried their own story. Some were outgoing, socially embedded in multiple groups, known by name across different classrooms. Others were quieter, moving through the school with fewer interactions, but still participating in its daily rhythm. There were students who felt completely at home in the social structure of the school, and others who felt slightly detached from it, observing rather than fully participating. This diversity of experience is what gives a school its complexity, even before any external disruption occurs. Among those students were individuals whose lives would later become central to public memory of the day, though at the time, they were simply living ordinary teenage routines. Some were thinking about college applications. Others were focused on sports, music, or extracurricular commitments. A few were dealing with personal struggles that never reached public visibility. Each of them existed within a network of relationships, expectations, and small daily interactions that formed the texture of school life. The teachers who worked with them often knew these details in fragments. A student who excelled in one subject, but struggled in another. A student who was quiet in class, but active in clubs. A student who occasionally missed assignments, but showed strong potential. These observations created a mosaic of understanding, incomplete, but meaningful, shaping how educators interacted with their students on a daily basis. What made this environment powerful was not its perfection, but its familiarity. People knew the patterns of the school well enough to recognize when something felt slightly off, even if they could not immediately define it. That sensitivity is part of what makes educational environments both stable and vulnerable at the same time. Stability comes from routine, but routine also creates expectations that can be disrupted in ways that are difficult to anticipate. On that morning, there was no widespread sense of danger. Instead, there was normal anticipation of the school day progressing toward its early end. Students moved between classes, some already mentally preparing for the afternoon ahead. Conversations drifted between academic topics and personal plans. Hallways carried the usual combination of footsteps, laughter, and the overlapping voices of hundreds of individuals navigating shared space. Outside the immediate academic structure, the broader community of Parkland maintained its own rhythm. Parents dropped off students and went about their workday, trusting the school environment to provide structure and safety. That trust is not usually articulated explicitly, but it is deeply embedded in the functioning of education systems. It allows parents to disengage temporarily, confident that their children are in a controlled environment. Within the school, administrative staff managed logistics, attendance, and daily operations. Security procedures existed, but were integrated into normal functioning rather than treated as extraordinary measures. Doors were monitored. Visitors were checked in. These systems were designed to handle common risks, not rare catastrophic events. Like many institutions, the school operated on the assumption that extreme disruption was unlikely. This assumption shaped behavior at every level. Students did not scan hallways for danger. Teachers did not interpret minor interruptions as potential threats. Staff did not expect the normal flow of the day to be fundamentally interrupted. This is not a failure of awareness. It is how daily life is structured in environments where safety is generally reliable. And yet, within this ordinary setting, there were also individuals whose histories had already diverged from the shared experience of the school. One such individual was Nicholas Cruz. His connection to the school was no longer that of a student participating in its present, but of someone whose presence had shifted into its past. His earlier time within the institution had been marked by behavioral concerns, disciplinary responses, and increasing separation from the social and academic environment around him. These records, when later reviewed, would form part of a larger attempt to understand how warning signs are identified and interpreted within educational systems. Teachers and staff had interacted with him in various contexts, observing patterns of behavior that raised concern, but did not necessarily point toward a specific, foreseeable outcome. This distinction is critical. Schools operate within frameworks that prioritize intervention based on observable risk, but not all risk is clearly legible in advance. Over time, his disengagement from the school environment increased. Like many students who struggle within institutional systems, his trajectory moved away from structured participation. Eventually, he was no longer part of the student body. But removal from enrollment did not erase his connection to the physical and emotional geography of the school. That connection remained in memory, records, and the institutional history of those who had interacted with him. This separation between individual trajectory and institutional continuity is one of the underlying dynamics that later became central to understanding the event. Schools are designed to absorb constant turnover. Students arrive, progress, and leave. The system continues regardless. But when an individual's path intersects violently with that system after separation, the assumption of distance is revealed to be incomplete. On February 14, 2018, however, none of this future interpretation existed. The school was still functioning entirely within the present. Students were still exchanging gifts. Teachers were still managing lessons. The building was still filled with the ordinary sounds of a day that had not yet been defined by what would later happen within it. That is what makes the study of this moment so difficult. It exists at the boundary between ordinary life and irreversible change, where nothing appears unusual until suddenly everything is. At first, the shift was not recognized as a single event. It was experienced as fragments, scattered across different parts of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, each fragment interpreted differently depending on location, awareness, and proximity. In environments like schools, reality does not always arrive as a unified narrative. It arrives as interruption, confusion, and partial understanding before it becomes something fully defined. The initial disruption began in a way that many inside the building did not immediately comprehend. A sound, a movement, a sudden change in the expected rhythm of the day. At first, it was not categorized correctly by everyone who experienced it. In a school setting, unfamiliar events are often filtered through familiar explanations. People think of drills, technical issues, or procedural announcements before they consider something more severe. That delay between perception and recognition would become one of the most critical elements of what followed. Inside classrooms, teachers and students reacted in different ways depending on how quickly they understood that something was wrong. Some classrooms continued their activities for several moments, unaware that conditions outside had changed. Others paused immediately, sensing that something in the environment no longer matched expectation. This uneven awareness created a fragmented response across the school, where different rooms existed in slightly different versions of the same moment. As the situation developed, movement within the building became irregular. Hallways that had been predictable earlier in the day now carried a different energy. Students who were transitioning between classes encountered uncertainty rather than routine. Some turned back. Others moved forward without full understanding of what was happening. The lack of clear information amplified hesitation, and hesitation in a large, interconnected space like a school quickly becomes collective uncertainty. Within classrooms, teachers began making rapid decisions based on incomplete information. Doors were closed. Lights were turned off. Students were instructed to move away from windows and remain silent. These actions were not uniform across the building, but they followed similar principles rooted in training and instinct. The goal was not to fully understand the situation, but to reduce exposure and maintain control within limited spaces. Communication between rooms and administrative areas was inconsistent. Messages were sent, but not always received. Phones were used quietly, often under desks, or in corners of rooms, as individuals attempted to gather information without drawing attention. In some cases, information was delayed or incomplete, increasing uncertainty. In others, messages arrived too late to influence immediate decisions. As the situation escalated, certain areas of the school experienced more direct impact than others. The geometry of the building, its hallways, intersections, and classroom clusters, meant that proximity played a decisive role in how events unfolded spatially. Some spaces became sites of immediate crisis, while others remained temporarily insulated from direct exposure. This uneven distribution of experience created a complex internal landscape within the school, where different groups were experiencing different levels of urgency simultaneously. Students in affected areas reacted instinctively. Some sought cover within classrooms. Others moved toward exits, guided by partial information or instinctive urgency. The flow of movement was not orderly. It was shaped by confusion, fear, and the rapid attempt to interpret changing conditions. In crowded corridors, decision-making became compressed into seconds, and those seconds carried disproportionate consequences. Teachers in multiple classrooms took immediate protective actions. Doors were locked. Furniture was used to reinforce entrances. Students were guided to stay low and remain quiet. These responses were shaped by training protocols, but also by instinctive protective behavior. In those moments, the role of teacher shifted from instruction to protection, and the classroom became a space defined not by learning, but by containment. The emotional experience inside those rooms varied. Some students remained silent and still, following instructions precisely. Others struggled with fear that manifested in visible tension, shaking hands, or uncontrolled breathing. The psychological pressure of uncertainty was amplified by the inability to fully understand what was occurring beyond the classroom walls. Sound, movement, and partial information became the only indicators of external reality. Outside the immediate building, the environment was still transitioning into awareness. The broader school grounds had not yet fully absorbed the scale of what was happening inside. Students and staff in unaffected areas began to sense disruption through indirect signals, changes in movement patterns, unexpected instructions, or visible responses from others. Information spread unevenly, creating a layered understanding of the situation that evolved over time rather than appearing all at once. As awareness increased, the school entered a state of partial lockdown. Movement was restricted. Access points were controlled. Individuals were instructed to remain in place. The structure of the school, normally defined by flow and transition, became static. Hallways emptied. Doors remained closed. The building shifted from dynamic movement to controlled stillness. Within this stillness, time felt altered. Minutes extended. Silence became heavier. Every small sound gained significance, because it could not be immediately contextualized. The absence of complete information created a psychological environment where imagination filled gaps, often in ways that increased anxiety. Uncertainty itself became a defining condition of the moment. Emergency responders were activated and began arriving at the scene. Law enforcement units moved toward the school with urgency, coordinating entry and search procedures. Their arrival marked a transition in the event from internal confusion to structured external response. The building was no longer only a school experiencing disruption. It had become a secured incident site requiring systematic intervention. Inside, however, the experience remained fragmented. Different groups within the school continued to operate with varying levels of information. Some were aware that the situation was severe. Others still lacked clarity about the nature of the threat. This uneven distribution of knowledge shaped behavior in ways that were not always aligned, but were consistent with the limited information available to each group. Throughout this period, the individual later identified as Nicholas Cruz moved through the environment in a way that would later be reconstructed through investigation, witness accounts, and forensic analysis. At the time, however, his actions were experienced by those present only as part of the unfolding disruption, without full understanding of his role in the larger sequence of events. The complexity of the situation lay not only in the actions themselves, but in how those actions interacted with space, perception, and limited communication. In environments like schools, where many people share a single structure, but experience it through isolated rooms and corridors, events can unfold simultaneously yet be perceived differently depending on location. As the situation progressed, the school became a layered environment of responses, locked classrooms, silent hallways, coordinated emergency movement, and individuals attempting to maintain safety within constrained spaces. Each layer represented a different level of awareness and reaction, contributing to a complex and evolving internal map of the event. And within that map, the initial confusion that marked the beginning of the incident gradually transformed into recognition that something far more serious was unfolding, changing the nature of every decision made in the moments that followed. In the immediate aftermath of the first confirmed reports of violence inside Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, the building transformed from an educational environment into an active emergency scene. What had begun as confusion was now being redefined through urgency, coordination, and rapid deployment of law enforcement. The school, which only minutes earlier had been operating under normal academic rhythm, was now a sealed environment where every corridor, classroom, and intersection carried potential significance. Outside the building, the first visible sign that something serious was unfolding came in the form of movement. Police vehicles arrived quickly, their presence shifting the atmosphere around the campus. The perimeter began to form almost immediately, not through a single command, but through layers of response from multiple agencies converging on the same location. Officers moved toward entrances, while others directed traffic away from the school grounds, creating controlled boundaries around an increasingly unstable situation. Inside, the first priority for many classrooms was silence. Teachers who had trained for emergency procedures acted quickly, not with certainty, but with practiced urgency. Doors were locked, lights were turned off, and students were instructed to move away from visibility points, such as windows and doors. Desks were pulled closer together in some rooms, forming physical barriers that were not designed for protection against violence, but became improvised forms of security in the absence of anything else. The experience of those inside classrooms varied, but a common emotional pattern emerged: heightened awareness combined with limited information. Students crouched in silence, often unable to see what was happening outside their immediate room. Communication with the outside world was inconsistent. Some were able to send brief messages to family members, while others had no opportunity to communicate at all. Each message sent carried disproportionate emotional weight, because it might have been one of the last forms of contact available. As emergency responders moved deeper into the building, the environment became increasingly complex. The school's layout, designed for accessibility and movement during normal operations, now presented challenges for rapid navigation under crisis conditions. Hallways intersected at multiple points, stairwells created vertical layers of movement, and classroom clusters formed isolated pockets of information and risk. Every decision about movement required balancing speed with caution. At the same time, the flow of information outside the school was fragmented. Initial reports were incomplete, often based on partial observation or second-hand accounts. This created uncertainty among families who were arriving at the perimeter. Parents gathered in large groups, standing behind police lines, trying to understand the situation while receiving limited updates. The emotional intensity of this space was defined by waiting without clarity, where every passing minute increased anxiety. Inside the school, the distinction between safe and unsafe areas was not immediately visible. Different classrooms experienced different levels of awareness depending on proximity and timing. Some rooms remained unaware of the full scope of the situation for longer periods, while others were already fully engaged in emergency response behavior. This uneven awareness created a patchwork of experiences across the building, where time and understanding were not synchronized. As officers moved through corridors, they encountered locked doors and secured classrooms. Each room represented a microenvironment of controlled stillness, where students and teachers were attempting to remain unseen and unheard. Entry procedures required verification and caution, as the identity of individuals inside each space could not be assumed. This careful approach slowed movement, but reduced risk in an environment where uncertainty was high. Within these classrooms, emotional responses varied widely. Some students remained remarkably still, focused entirely on instructions. Others struggled to maintain composure, reacting to fear with visible distress. Teachers often positioned themselves between students and doors, not as a symbolic act, but as a physical layer of protection. These moments were shaped by instinct as much as training, reflecting the human response to situations that exceed normal experience. The presence of law enforcement inside the building introduced a new phase in the unfolding situation. Their movement was deliberate and structured, guided by protocols designed for active threat environments. Communication between units was constant but restrained, reflecting the need for coordination without revealing positions unnecessarily. Each corridor cleared, each room secured, contributed to a gradually expanding map of control within the school. At the same time, outside communication channels continued to intensify. Families were receiving partial information through various sources, including official updates and personal messages from inside the building. This created a dual-layered experience, official narratives emerging slowly through authorities, and personal narratives arriving in fragmented, emotional bursts from individuals inside the school. The emotional weight of these communications was significant. A single message could shift the emotional state of entire families waiting outside. The uncertainty of not knowing combined with the immediacy of partial information created a psychological environment defined by instability. Every update carried both relief and fear, depending on its content and absence of detail. Inside the school, responders continued systematic movement through the building. Areas were cleared methodically, with attention given to ensuring that each space was fully secured before proceeding. The structure of the school required constant adaptation, as hallways, intersections, and stairwells created multiple possible routes and points of ambiguity. This complexity made the process both slow and highly coordinated. As the situation progressed, understanding of the internal layout became more refined. Responders developed a clearer sense of which areas had been accessed, which remained uncertain, and which required immediate attention. This evolving understanding was essential for reducing confusion and ensuring that no area was overlooked during the response. Meanwhile, Inside classrooms that remained under lockdown, time felt increasingly distorted. Without access to full information, students and teachers relied on silence and waiting as their primary experience of the moment. Every sound outside the room carried amplified meaning. Every shift in atmosphere was interpreted cautiously. The absence of clear information created a psychological environment where imagination often filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Throughout the building, the presence of emergency protocols shaped behavior in subtle but important ways. The decision to lock doors, remain silent, and stay out of sight reflected a collective understanding of how to respond to unknown threats. These actions were not identical in every classroom, but they shared a common purpose: minimizing exposure while awaiting resolution. Outside, the perimeter continued to expand and stabilize. Law enforcement established zones of control, directing incoming resources and managing access to the site. Media presence began to increase, though information remained limited. The gap between public awareness and internal reality widened, creating a situation where speculation often outpaced confirmed facts. At the center of all this movement remained the unfolding reality inside the school, where the actions of Nicholas Cruz were being interpreted, contained and eventually brought under control through coordinated response. At the time, however, those inside the building were experiencing only fragments of the larger situation, each from their own limited perspective. The complexity of this phase of the event lies in its fragmentation. No single group had full visibility. Instead, there were overlapping layers of understanding, each shaped by position, timing, and access to information. These layers would later be reconstructed through investigation, but at the moment they existed only as isolated experiences. As emergency operations continued, the situation gradually moved toward stabilization. The school, once filled with movement and uncertainty, was being systematically brought under control. But for those inside, the experience of those moments remained defined by uncertainty, silence, and the effort to remain safe in a situation that was still unfolding in real time. In the hours and days following the immediate lockdown of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, the focus of law enforcement shifted from urgent containment to structured investigation. What had begun as a rapidly evolving emergency inside the building was now transforming into a complex reconstruction of events. The school was no longer just a scene of crisis. It had become a vast evidentiary environment where every hallway, classroom, and object could hold significance. The first phase of investigation began even before the building was fully reopened. Specialized units worked to secure and document the interior. Every space was treated as part of a larger puzzle that needed to be preserved in its post-incident state. This included photographing classrooms, mapping movement patterns, and collecting physical evidence that might help reconstruct the sequence of events. The building itself felt suspended in time, frozen at the moment when normal life had collapsed. At the center of the investigation was the effort to establish a clear timeline. Authorities needed to understand not only what happened, but when and how it unfolded across different parts of the school. This required synchronizing multiple sources of information: surveillance footage, emergency communications, witness statements, and physical evidence. Each source provided only a partial view, and only by combining them could investigators begin to form a coherent picture. Witness accounts from students and teachers became one of the most important components of the investigation. However, these accounts were often fragmented by the nature of trauma. Many described events in non-linear ways, focusing on sensory impressions rather than chronological order. Sounds, movements, and emotional reactions were recalled more clearly than precise sequences of time. Investigators had to carefully piece these narratives together, recognizing that memory under extreme stress does not always follow structured logic. Inside the school records, investigators also examined emergency procedures and response protocols. They studied how lockdown procedures had been implemented, how communication systems functioned during the incident, and how different parts of the building responded to the unfolding situation. This analysis was not about assigning immediate blame, but about understanding how systems behaved under extreme pressure. At the same time, attention turned to the individual responsible for initiating the event. Nicholas Cruz became the central focus of the investigative narrative. His movements, decisions, and preparation were reconstructed through a combination of physical evidence and digital traces. Investigators examined his background, behavioral history, and prior interactions with institutions and individuals. One of the key challenges in the investigation was understanding how warning signs, if present, had been interpreted prior to the incident. Records showed that Cruz had interacted with various systems over time, including educational and social support structures. These interactions were reviewed in detail to determine whether any clear intervention points had been missed or misinterpreted. However, the complexity of behavioral prediction meant that many of these indicators had not formed a unified signal at the time. Digital evidence also played a significant role. Investigators reviewed online activity, communication records, and digital footprints that helped establish patterns of behavior leading up to the event. This material provided insight into mindset and planning, but it also required careful interpretation to avoid oversimplifying psychological complexity. Each piece of data had to be understood within context rather than isolation. As the investigation deepened, attention also turned to physical evidence recovered from the school and surrounding areas. Objects, pathways, and environmental markers were analyzed to reconstruct movement patterns. Bullet trajectories, entry points, and spatial positioning were carefully documented to understand how the incident unfolded within the architectural structure of the building. This spatial reconstruction revealed how the design of the school influenced the progression of events. Corridors, classroom clusters, and access points created a network of movement that shaped how individuals experienced the incident. Some areas were reached quickly, while others remained temporarily insulated. These spatial differences became crucial in understanding the uneven distribution of impact throughout the building. Investigators also examined the response of emergency services in detail. This included analyzing dispatch records, arrival times, and tactical decisions made during entry into the building. The goal was to create a comprehensive understanding of how external response systems interacted with the internal conditions of the school during the critical period of the event. At the same time, interviews continued with survivors, teachers, and first responders. These interviews were conducted carefully, often over extended periods, to avoid re-traumatization while still gathering essential information. Survivors provided critical insights into the lived experience of the event, helping investigators understand not only what happened, but how it was perceived from inside the building. Many of these accounts highlighted the fragmented nature of perception during the incident. Individuals often described only their immediate surroundings, without awareness of the full scope of events occurring elsewhere in the school. This reinforced the idea that the incident was experienced not as a single continuous event, but as multiple overlapping realities. As evidence accumulated, investigators began to construct a detailed timeline of actions attributed to Nicholas Cruz. This timeline included entry into the school, movement through specific areas, and interactions with different parts of the environment. Each segment of movement was cross-referenced with witness accounts and physical evidence to ensure accuracy. The investigation also examined how Cruz had acquired materials used in the incident. This included reviewing purchase records and legal pathways through which those materials were obtained. These findings contributed to broader discussions about regulatory systems and access control, though within the investigation itself, the focus remained on factual reconstruction rather than policy interpretation. As days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded beyond the immediate incident to include broader contextual analysis. This included reviewing institutional practices, behavioral intervention systems, and communication between different agencies prior to the event. The goal was to understand not only what occurred, but how multiple systems interacted in ways that may have influenced outcomes. Throughout this process, investigators remained aware that the case extended beyond technical reconstruction. Every piece of evidence represented human experience. Every timeline entry corresponded to moments that had profound emotional consequences for those involved. This awareness shaped how information was handled, documented, and eventually prepared for legal proceedings. By the time the investigative phase began to stabilize into structured reporting, a complex and detailed picture had emerged. It was not a simple narrative of cause and effect, but a layered sequence of decisions, movements, and interactions within a specific environment under extreme conditions. The school, once a place of routine education, had become the center of one of the most closely examined mass casualty investigations in recent history. And at the core of that reconstruction remained the effort to understand how a sequence of individual actions by Nicholas Cruz intersected with institutional systems, physical space, and human perception to produce an event that would permanently alter the lives of those connected to IT.in complex criminal investigations. There is often a moment when scattered fragments of evidence begin to align into a structure that investigators can finally recognize as direction. In the case surrounding Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, that moment did not arrive quickly or cleanly. Instead, it emerged gradually, as overlapping strands of testimony, digital records, and forensic analysis began to converge on a clearer understanding of the individual responsible for the attack. At the center of that convergence remained Nicholas Cruz, whose actions were being reconstructed not as isolated moments of violence, but as part of a broader sequence that extended backward into preparation and forward into legal accountability. What investigators began to identify was not a sudden impulse, but a pattern of behavior and decision-making that had unfolded over time, hidden in plain sight, within systems that were not designed to interpret extreme outcomes with precision. The breakthrough in the investigative process did not come from a single piece of evidence. Instead, it came from the accumulation of small confirmations across multiple domains. Surveillance data helped clarify movement patterns. Witness accounts narrowed timelines. Digital footprints provided context for intent and planning. Each layer reinforced the others, gradually reducing ambiguity and transforming uncertainty into a more structured narrative. One of the most significant developments occurred when investigators were able to synchronize multiple timelines from within the school environment. By aligning video footage, communication logs, and physical evidence, they were able to reconstruct a sequence of movement that showed how the incident progressed through different areas of the building. This spatial and temporal mapping became a foundational element in understanding how the event unfolded. As this reconstruction became more precise, investigators also began to identify moments of decision-making that defined the trajectory of the incident. These were not interpreted as spontaneous reactions, but as deliberate choices made within a specific context. Each movement through the school was analyzed in relation to environmental conditions, access points, and observed behavior patterns. This allowed for a clearer understanding of how the incident escalated within a relatively short time frame. In parallel, behavioral analysis of Nicholas Cruz became increasingly detailed. Experts reviewed his developmental history, psychological evaluations, and documented interactions with educational and social systems. The goal was not simply to label behavior, but to understand how multiple factors interacted over time to produce a trajectory that ultimately led to irreversible consequences. What emerged from this analysis was a complex profile that resisted simple categorization. There were documented instances of emotional instability, social withdrawal, and behavioral disruption, but these elements existed within a broader context of inconsistent intervention and fragmented communication between systems. No single institution held a complete picture, and as a result, no unified preventive response had been activated prior to the event. Investigators also examined the role of environmental familiarity in the execution of the attack. The fact that the location was a former school environment introduced additional complexity into spatial analysis. Familiarity with layout and structure was considered relevant in understanding movement efficiency and target selection patterns. This aspect of the investigation required careful separation of environmental knowledge from behavioral intent, ensuring that conclusions remained grounded in evidence rather than assumption. As the investigative team refined its understanding, attention increasingly shifted toward the legal dimension of the case. The accumulation of evidence was being organized not only for reconstruction, but for presentation in court. This required transforming raw investigative material into structured arguments that could be evaluated within a judicial framework. Chain of custody, evidentiary integrity, and procedural clarity became central concerns. During this phase, the role of expert testimony became particularly important. Forensic specialists, behavioral analysts, and law enforcement officials contributed interpretations of the evidence that helped bridge gaps between technical findings and legal standards. These testimonies were not merely descriptive. They were interpretive frameworks designed to make complex data accessible within the constraints of a courtroom environment. At the same time, defense preparation began to focus on psychological and neurological factors related to the defendant's mental state. The argument centered on whether Nicholas Cruz possessed the capacity to fully understand and control his actions at the time of the incident. This introduced a different layer of analysis, one that required evaluation of cognitive function, behavioral history, and psychiatric assessment. The interaction between prosecution and defense strategies created a structured tension within the case. On one side, the emphasis was on deliberate planning and conscious execution. On the other, the focus was on impairment and diminished responsibility. Both perspectives relied on the same underlying evidence, but interpreted it through different conceptual frameworks. As the legal process advanced, the volume of documentation grew significantly. Court filings, evidentiary exhibits, and procedural motions created a dense record that reflected not only the specifics of the case, but also the complexity of translating real-world events into legal language. Each piece of evidence had to be contextualized, verified, and presented in a way that could withstand scrutiny under cross-examination. One of the key challenges during this phase was maintaining clarity in the face of emotional intensity. The case was not abstract. It involved profound human loss and trauma. However, legal proceedings required a structured approach that could separate emotional impact from evidentiary evaluation. This balance was difficult to maintain, particularly in a case that had already drawn significant public attention. As the case moved closer to trial proceedings, the investigative breakthrough that had been forming over time became fully integrated into a coherent evidentiary narrative. The sequence of events, the behavioral context, and the environmental analysis all contributed to a consolidated understanding of what had occurred inside the school on that day. However, even as clarity increased within the legal framework, certain questions remained inherently complex. The interaction between individual behavior and systemic oversight could not be reduced to a single explanatory factor. Instead, the case revealed multiple intersecting layers of responsibility, perception, and limitation, each contributing to the overall outcome in different ways. Throughout this process, the presence of victims and survivors remained central, even when not explicitly part of investigative focus. Every reconstructed timeline, every behavioral analysis, and every legal argument ultimately pointed back to the human impact of the event. This awareness influenced how evidence was handled and how findings were communicated. By the time the investigative phase transitioned into formal legal proceedings, the breakthrough was no longer a single moment of discovery, but a sustained process of alignment between evidence, interpretation, and legal structure. The case had moved from uncertainty toward definition, not through sudden revelation, but through accumulated clarity built across multiple systems of inquiry. And at the center of that clarity remained the effort to understand how the actions of one individual, Nicholas Cruz, intersected with institutional structures, environmental conditions, and human vulnerability to produce an event that would continue to be examined long after the investigation itself had formally concluded. The courtroom phase of the case involving Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland marked a shift in the narrative from reconstruction to accountability. What had previously existed as fragmented evidence, investigative reports, and survivor testimony now entered a structured legal environment where every detail had to be weighed under formal rules of admissibility, procedure, and interpretation. The courtroom became the final arena where the meaning of the events would be argued, examined, and ultimately judged. At the center of the proceedings remained Nicholas Cruz, whose presence in court represented not only the individual accused of carrying out the attack, but also the focal point through which the entire case would be understood. The legal system required that his actions be translated into charges, and those charges in turn had to be supported by evidence that could withstand scrutiny from both prosecution and defense. From the beginning of the trial, the structure of the proceedings reflected the complexity of the case. The prosecution aimed to establish a clear narrative of intent, planning, and execution. They presented evidence that had been gathered during the investigation, including forensic data, digital records, witness testimony, and reconstructed timelines. Each piece of evidence was introduced not in isolation, but as part of a larger framework designed to demonstrate a coherent sequence of deliberate actions. The defense, on the other hand, focused on a different aspect of the case. Their argument centered on mental state, cognitive capacity, and psychological history. They sought to establish that the defendant's ability to fully understand or control his actions was impaired. This introduced a competing narrative within the courtroom, one that did not deny the events themselves, but challenged the interpretation of responsibility. As these two perspectives unfolded, the courtroom became a space of structured contradiction. Evidence that appeared straightforward in the investigative phase now required interpretation through legal standards. Witness accounts were examined for consistency and reliability. Expert testimony was evaluated for methodology and relevance. Even physical evidence had to be contextualized within competing arguments about intent and awareness. One of the most powerful elements of the prosecution's case was the reconstruction of the timeline. Using data collected during the investigation, they presented a detailed sequence of movements and actions that occurred within the school. This reconstruction was critical in establishing that the events were not random or chaotic in intent, but followed a discernible pattern consistent with planning and execution. At the same time, the defense introduced extensive psychological evaluations of Nicholas Cruz. These evaluations included expert analysis of behavioral history, cognitive functioning, and emotional regulation. The goal was to provide context for actions that, while clearly established in fact, required interpretation regarding mental state at the time they occurred. The courtroom was also shaped by the presence of survivor testimony. Individuals who had been inside the school during the incident provided first-hand accounts of their experiences. These testimonies were emotionally powerful, but they were also carefully structured within legal parameters. Each witness was guided through their recollections in a way that allowed the court to understand their perspective while maintaining procedural clarity. What made these testimonies particularly significant was not only their emotional weight, but their contribution to the broader evidentiary picture. They helped confirm timelines, clarify spatial movement within the building, and provide context for how events were perceived from inside the environment. However, they also highlighted the limitations of memory under extreme stress, as different accounts sometimes varied in detail while aligning in core experience. Throughout the trial, the judge played a critical role in maintaining structure and ensuring that legal standards were upheld. The admissibility of evidence, the conduct of attorneys, and the clarity of proceedings all required constant oversight. In a case of this magnitude, procedural integrity was essential to ensuring that the final outcome would be legally sound and defensible under appeal. As the trial progressed, the emotional intensity of the proceedings remained high. Families of victims attended sessions regularly, often sitting through long days of testimony and legal argument. Their presence added a human dimension to a process that was otherwise governed by procedural language and evidentiary rules. The courtroom, while structured around law, remained deeply connected to personal loss and lived experience. The legal arguments themselves became increasingly complex as both sides refined their positions. The prosecution emphasized premeditation and behavioral consistency leading up to the event. They argued that the pattern of actions demonstrated awareness and intentionality. The defense countered by emphasizing psychological impairment and the influence of long-term mental health issues on decision-making capacity. These competing arguments required the jury to engage with difficult questions that extended beyond the facts of the case. They had to consider not only what happened, but how responsibility should be defined under the law. This included evaluating expert testimony, interpreting legal instructions, and applying those interpretations to the evidence presented. As deliberations approached, the courtroom atmosphere became increasingly focused. The presentation of evidence had concluded, and the legal teams had delivered their final arguments. What remained was the process of jury consideration, where all information would be weighed collectively to reach a verdict. Eventually, the jury reached a decision. Nicholas Cruz was found guilty of the charges related to the events at the school. This verdict represented the culmination of years of investigation, testimony, and legal argument. It confirmed, within the structure of the legal system, the responsibility for the actions that had taken place inside the school on that day. However, the trial did not end with the verdict alone. The sentencing phase introduced additional considerations, including the question of whether the death penalty should be applied, or whether life imprisonment without the possibility of parole was more appropriate. This phase required the jury to evaluate aggravating and mitigating factors, including the severity of the crime, the impact on victims, and the arguments presented regarding mental health. The sentencing deliberations were particularly complex, because they required balancing legal standards with moral considerations. The prosecution emphasized the scale of harm and the deliberate nature of the actions. The defense reiterated arguments related to psychological impairment and personal history. The jury had to weigh these factors within the strict framework of sentencing law. Ultimately, the jury recommended life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This decision brought legal closure to the case, establishing a final judicial outcome that would define the formal conclusion of the trial. It reflected a consensus that, while the actions were fully established and legally attributed, the appropriate sentence fell short of capital punishment. The courtroom phase of the case thus concluded with a result that was both definitive and deeply complex. It provided legal resolution, but it did not resolve the broader questions raised by the events themselves. The impact on survivors, families, and the broader community continued beyond the courtroom, extending into social, political, and emotional dimensions that could not be fully addressed through legal process alone. And within that final judgment, the case of Nicholas Cruz remained not only a legal record, but a lasting reference point in discussions about justice, responsibility, and the limits of the judicial system in addressing events of extreme human consequence. In the aftermath of the trial involving Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, the courtroom silence that followed the final sentencing carried a different weight than the silence experienced during the legal proceedings themselves. This was no longer the silence of testimony or deliberation, but the silence of conclusion. The formal structure of justice had reached its endpoint, yet the human reality surrounding the case remained open, unresolved in emotional and social terms. The case of Nicholas Cruz had now entered a different phase of existence. It was no longer primarily defined by active investigation or courtroom argument. Instead, it became part of public memory, institutional analysis, and ongoing cultural reflection. The legal system had assigned responsibility and imposed sentencing, but society as a whole was left to process the meaning of what had occurred and how it should be understood in the long term. For the families of victims, the period following the trial was marked by a transition that was difficult to define as closure. The courtroom verdict provided legal finality, but emotional resolution followed a different timeline, if it could be said to follow a timeline at all. Grief did not conform to procedural milestones. Instead, it continued in cycles, often triggered by anniversaries, media coverage, or unexpected reminders of the event. Many families began to navigate a new form of existence, in which memory and daily life were constantly intertwined. Ordinary moments carried echoes of what had been lost. A classroom, a hallway, a photograph, or even a routine sound could bring the event back into immediate emotional presence. This persistence of memory created a reality in which the past was never fully separate from the present. Survivors of the incident also faced long-term psychological consequences that extended beyond the immediate aftermath. While physical recovery was a visible process for some, emotional and cognitive recovery was less linear. Many individuals reported ongoing difficulties with anxiety, heightened awareness in public spaces, and emotional responses triggered by environments similar to the school. These reactions were not uniform, but they reflected a shared experience of disruption in how safety was perceived. Within the broader community of Parkland, the event continued to shape identity and collective memory. The town, previously associated with suburban stability and quiet residential life, had become linked in public consciousness to one of the most widely discussed school tragedies in recent history. This association influenced how the community was represented in media, how it was discussed in national conversations, and how residents themselves understood their shared experience. At Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the process of returning to daily functioning was gradual and complex. The physical space of the school remained, but its meaning had fundamentally changed. Classrooms that once represented routine education now carried layers of memory that could not be separated from their physical structure. Every corridor and room contained traces of what had occurred, not in visible form, but in collective awareness. Reopening and continuing academic activity required careful coordination. Decisions about how to resume normal operations were made with consideration for emotional impact, safety concerns, and community expectations. The goal was not to erase the past, but to create conditions under which education could continue despite it. This balance between remembrance and continuation became a defining challenge for the institution. In the broader national context, the case contributed to ongoing discussions about school safety, mental health systems, and preventive intervention frameworks. Policymakers, educators, and researchers examined the event from multiple perspectives, attempting to identify structural weaknesses and potential areas for reform. These discussions often extended beyond the specifics of the case itself, touching on broader questions about how institutions identify and respond to behavioral risk. The figure of Nicholas Cruz remained central to these discussions, not as an individual in isolation, but as part of a larger analytical framework used to examine how multiple systems intersected in ways that allowed the event to occur. These systems included educational environments, social services, legal regulations, and community-based interventions. Each contributed in different ways to the overall context in which the event unfolded. However, even as structural analysis expanded, there remained a persistent recognition that no single explanation could fully account for the complexity of what had occurred. The event resisted simplification. It involved individual decisions, systemic limitations, environmental conditions, and unpredictable interactions between all three. This complexity made it difficult to derive singular conclusions or universally applicable lessons. In media coverage, the narrative of the case gradually shifted from immediate reporting to long-term reflection. Documentaries, articles, and public discussions began to explore not only what happened, but what it meant. These interpretations varied widely, reflecting different perspectives on responsibility, prevention, and societal impact. Some focused on policy implications, while others emphasized human stories and personal experiences. Public discourse also included the voices of survivors who became advocates for change. Their perspectives added a deeply personal dimension to broader policy discussions. They spoke about safety, prevention, and the need for systemic improvement, drawing on lived experience rather than abstract analysis. Their involvement helped shape how the event was understood in public conversation, particularly in discussions about school safety measures. At the same time, debates emerged regarding how such events should be represented in media and education. Questions were raised about the balance between awareness and sensitivity, between documentation and respect for those directly affected. These discussions reflected a broader cultural effort to understand how societies process collective trauma over time. Within academic and professional fields, the case became part of ongoing research into behavioral analysis, emergency response systems, and institutional preparedness. Studies examined communication breakdowns, response coordination, and environmental design in school settings. The goal was not only to analyze the specific case, but to contribute to broader understanding that might inform future prevention efforts. Despite these efforts, there remained an underlying recognition that complete prevention of such events is not fully achievable through systems alone. This acknowledgement introduced a layer of complexity into all discussions surrounding policy and practice. It highlighted the limits of predictive frameworks and the inherent uncertainty involved in human behavior. As years passed, the immediate intensity of the event gradually shifted into historical context. However, it did not fade from relevance. Instead, it became part of a continuing conversation about safety, responsibility, and collective memory. The case remained present in public discourse, referenced in discussions about education, law, and social policy. For those most directly affected, however, the passage of time did not transform the event into history in the same way. It remained an active part of lived experience. Memory continued to shape daily life, influencing decisions, emotions, and perceptions of safety. In this sense, the event remained ongoing, even as its legal and investigative dimensions had concluded. And so, while the courtroom chapter had ended and the formal legal process had reached its conclusion, the broader narrative surrounding Nicholas Cruz and the events at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School continued to exist in memory, reflection, and ongoing societal examination, where its meaning was still being interpreted long after the final verdict had been delivered. In the years following the conclusion of the legal proceedings in the case involving Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, the focus of public attention gradually shifted away from the courtroom and toward the long-term consequences that continued to unfold in its aftermath. Although the judicial system had reached a formal resolution in the case of Nicholas Cruz, the broader social, psychological, and cultural impact of the event remained active, evolving in ways that could not be contained within legal boundaries. One of the most visible developments in the aftermath was the emergence of sustained advocacy efforts led by survivors. Students who had experienced the event firsthand began to organize, speak publicly, and participate in national discussions about school safety and policy reform. Their voices carried a particular weight because they were grounded in direct experience rather than abstract debate. These individuals transformed their personal trauma into public engagement, shaping conversations far beyond the boundaries of their community. In Parkland, the presence of these survivor voices became a defining aspect of the community's identity in the years that followed. While the town had once been associated primarily with suburban calm, it now occupied a place in national awareness as a symbol of both tragedy and activism. This dual identity created a complex relationship between memory and representation, as residents navigated how their community was perceived by the outside world. At Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School itself, the process of long-term adaptation continued quietly but persistently. The school remained operational, but its internal culture had changed in ways that were not always visible to external observers. Safety procedures became more integrated into daily routines, and awareness of emergency protocols became a permanent part of institutional life. The building functioned as both an educational environment and a site of collective memory. Students who entered the school in later years inherited this legacy, without having directly experienced the original event. For them, the history of the school was something learned rather than lived, yet it still shaped the environment they encountered. Orientation sessions, safety drills, and commemorative practices ensured that the memory of what had occurred remained present within the institution, even as new generations moved through it. Meanwhile, the figure of Nicholas Cruz continued to exist within the legal and correctional system, but his presence in public discourse evolved over time. He became less a subject of active legal debate and more a reference point within broader discussions about criminal justice, mental health evaluation, and institutional accountability. His case was frequently cited in academic, legal, and policy contexts as part of larger analyses of mass casualty events. In these discussions, attention often returned to questions about how such events are understood after they have been legally resolved. Scholars and analysts examined the gap between legal closure and social understanding, noting that while courts can determine responsibility and impose sentencing, they cannot fully address the broader questions of meaning, prevention, and long-term impact. The Parkland case became a frequently referenced example of this distinction. Educational policy discussions also continued to reference the event as part of broader efforts to improve school safety systems. These discussions included topics such as emergency preparedness, mental health support structures, threat assessment protocols, and communication systems within schools. While specific policy outcomes varied across jurisdictions, the case contributed to a sustained emphasis on prevention and early intervention strategies. However, even as institutional responses evolved, there remained recognition that no system could fully eliminate uncertainty. The unpredictable nature of human behavior meant that prevention efforts could reduce risk, but not completely remove it. This understanding introduced a level of complexity into policy discussions, where the goal was not absolute prevention, but continuous improvement and adaptation. In the media landscape, the event gradually transitioned from breaking news to long-form analysis. Documentaries, investigative reports, and retrospective features examined the case from multiple angles. Some focused on the investigative process, others on survivor experiences, and still others on systemic implications. Each interpretation contributed to a layered public understanding that extended beyond the initial event. Public memory of the case also became shaped by anniversaries, each of which brought renewed attention to the individuals affected and the broader implications of the event. These commemorations served both as moments of remembrance and as opportunities for reflection on how society had changed since the incident. For many, these anniversaries reinforced the ongoing nature of the impact, even years after the legal process had concluded. Within the survivor community, long-term psychological recovery remained a central concern. Many individuals continued to navigate the effects of trauma in different ways, including changes in emotional regulation, perception of safety, and response to environmental triggers. These experiences varied widely, reflecting the individual nature of trauma response. Some found strength in advocacy and public engagement, while others focused on personal healing and private reconstruction of daily life. The broader community of Parkland also continued to process its identity in relation to the event. Community initiatives, support networks, and memorial activities contributed to an ongoing effort to integrate the experience into collective memory. This process was not linear, and it did not result in a singular narrative. Instead, it produced a layered understanding of the community's history that included both its present identity and its past disruption. At the institutional level, Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School became a reference point in broader discussions about how schools respond to and recover from large-scale traumatic events. Researchers and educators examined how institutional culture adapts over time, how students and staff interact with spaces that carry historical weight, and how memory is preserved within functional environments. Throughout these discussions, the role of individuals like Nicholas Cruz remained part of the analytical framework, but increasingly as a component within larger systems of understanding rather than as the sole focus. The emphasis shifted toward examining how multiple factors intersected to produce conditions in which such an event could occur, and how similar conditions might be addressed in the future. As time continued to pass, the immediate emotional intensity of the event gradually softened in public discourse, but its significance did not diminish. Instead, it became embedded within a broader historical and cultural context. The case was referenced not only in discussions of crime and justice, but also in conversations about education, community resilience, and the limits of institutional protection. Ultimately, the long-term aftermath of the Parkland event demonstrated that the conclusion of a legal case does not mark the end of its impact. For those directly affected, and for the wider society that continues to reflect on it, the event remains part of an ongoing dialogue about safety, responsibility, and the fragile nature of everyday normalcy within shared public spaces. In the years that followed the immediate aftermath and legal resolution of the case involving Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, the narrative surrounding the event continued to evolve beyond the boundaries of courtroom testimony and official investigation. Even though the judicial system had reached a definitive outcome in the case of Nicholas Cruz, the broader meaning of the event remained open, constantly reinterpreted through memory, policy discussion, cultural reflection, and lived experience. What became increasingly clear over time was that the event did not exist as a single fixed story. Instead, it existed as multiple overlapping narratives, each shaped by perspective. For survivors, it remained a lived memory that could be triggered by everyday experiences. For families of victims, it remained an absence that continued to shape daily life. For the school community, it became part of institutional identity. And for society at large, it became a reference point in ongoing debates about safety, responsibility, and prevention. Within Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, the passage of time brought gradual, but permanent transformation. The physical environment of the school remained intact, yet its meaning had fundamentally changed. Classrooms where students once focused on ordinary academic concerns now carried an additional layer of emotional significance. Even routine activities such as entering a hallway, sitting in a classroom, or attending an assembly existed within a space shaped by collective memory. Students who enrolled after the event entered a school that already carried a defined historical identity. For them, the event was not something they had experienced directly, but something they inherited through orientation, stories, and institutional culture. This created a layered experience of the school environment, where present daily life coexisted with awareness of past tragedy. Teachers and staff carried the responsibility of maintaining educational normalcy, while also acknowledging that the institution's history could not be separated from its present. In the broader community of Parkland, the long-term impact extended beyond the school itself. The city became associated in national and international awareness with the events that had taken place, shaping how it was referenced in media and public discourse. This association influenced not only external perception, but also internal identity, as residents navigated how their community was understood by others while continuing their own daily lives. Survivors of the event continued to experience its effects in varied and evolving ways. For many, the immediate aftermath was characterized by acute emotional responses, but over time these responses shifted into longer-term psychological patterns. Certain environments, sounds, or situations could evoke strong emotional reactions even years later. These responses were not uniform, reflecting the individual nature of trauma, but they collectively illustrated the enduring impact of the experience. At the same time, many survivors developed pathways toward advocacy and public engagement. Their participation in public discussions about school safety and policy reform became a defining aspect of the post-event landscape. These individuals transformed personal experience into public voice, contributing to national and international conversations about how institutions respond to violence and how prevention systems can be improved. Their role extended beyond testimony into sustained engagement with policy, education, and civic dialogue. The presence of Nicholas Cruz within public discourse also shifted over time. While initially central to media coverage and legal proceedings, his role in public discussion gradually transitioned into a more contextual position. He became part of broader analyses of behavioral systems, institutional responses, and risk assessment frameworks. In academic and policy contexts, his case was frequently referenced as one example among many in the study of mass casualty events. This shift in focus reflected a broader change in how society processes complex traumatic events. Immediate attention often centers on individual actions and legal outcomes, but long-term analysis tends to expand outward, examining systemic factors, environmental conditions, and institutional interactions. The Parkland case became a frequently cited example in this transition from individual-centered narrative to systems-level understanding. Within educational research, the event contributed to ongoing studies on school safety, emergency preparedness, and institutional resilience. Researchers examined how schools design and implement safety protocols, how communication systems function under stress, and how physical environments influence movement and response during emergencies. These studies emphasized the importance of both procedural structure and human behavior in shaping outcomes during crisis situations. Policy discussions also continued to reference the event in debates about preventive measures and intervention strategies. Topics such as behavioral threat assessment, mental health support in schools, and access to intervention resources became central to these discussions. However, these conversations also acknowledged the inherent limitations of predictive systems. While risk factors can be identified, the translation of those factors into specific outcomes remains uncertain. Media representation of the event evolved significantly over time. Early coverage focused on real-time reporting and immediate aftermath, while later representations shifted toward reflection and analysis. Documentaries, interviews, and written retrospectives explored not only the factual sequence of events, but also the emotional and societal dimensions. These representations contributed to a layered public memory that combined factual record with interpretive narrative. Commemorative practices also became part of the long-term landscape. Anniversaries of the event were marked by moments of remembrance, reflection, and public acknowledgement. These occasions served as points of collective memory, reinforcing the ongoing significance of the event within both local and national contexts. For many, these anniversaries were not only about recalling what had happened, but about recognizing its continuing impact. Within the legal and academic communities, the case continued to be studied as part of broader discussions about criminal justice and mental health. The interaction between psychological evaluation, legal responsibility, and sentencing outcomes remained a subject of analysis. The case of Nicholas Cruz was frequently used as a reference point in examining how legal systems address complex questions of intent, capacity, and accountability. Despite the passage of time, the event continued to resist simple closure. While legal proceedings had concluded and institutional responses had been implemented, the broader questions it raised remained active. These included questions about how societies define safety, how institutions respond to warning signs, and how communities recover from collective trauma. For those directly affected, the passage of time did not erase the event, but rather integrated it into ongoing life experience. Memory became part of daily existence, influencing perception, behavior, and emotional response. In this sense, the event remained present even as it moved further into historical context. At the institutional level, Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School continued to operate as an educational environment, while also functioning as a site of remembrance. This dual role required continuous balance between normal academic activity and acknowledgement of historical significance. The school's identity became layered, reflecting both its ongoing mission and its place in collective memory. Ultimately, the long-term narrative of the Parkland event illustrates how a single moment in time can expand into a complex and enduring structure of meaning. The actions associated with Nicholas Cruz became part of a broader framework of analysis, memory, and reflection that continues to evolve. And within that ongoing evolution, the event remains not only a closed legal case, but an open subject of human understanding, shaped continuously by those who remember, study, and live with its consequences.